As previously stated, I'm JTG-P, and this presentation will be a sociolinguistic exploration and analysis of honorifics and formal speech Keigo within the Japanese language through 3 theoretical lenses. So, last spring, I traveled to Japan on one of UNF's study abroad programs, where for 5 months I had the opportunity to study Japanese religion, art, and language. While learning Japanese, I was eager to practice speaking with my fellow study abroad students and native Japanese speakers. However, I quickly learned that from everyone's reactions and chastisements that I was speaking very rude Japanese. This at first puzzled me, as I had been studying what the textbooks called plain form. It was not until I started studying Keigo that I realized how impolite plain form really is. As I learned more about Japanese honorifics, I became very fascinated with how Keigo plays an important role in both Japanese language and culture. So let's get into it. What is Keigo? The word Keigo is a broad term for honorifics in Japanese. Keigo, which directly translates into respectful language, has 3 main categories. The first, son Keigo, includes referent honorifics, which are used when elevating someone who is being talked about. Son Keigo can also be used when referring to and speaking with customers or superiors. Son Keigo is, however, rarely, if ever, used to speak about oneself. The second category of Keigo is kinjogo, which consists of humble honorific speech used when describing oneself and one's actions when speaking to superiors. The third form is tenego, which are addressee honorifics. They are polite forms used when speaking to superiors, but they are also typically used for sentence endings, such as the copula verb des and the verb ending mas. So here we have an example of how O added to T makes it honorable T. Some further examples. Tenego can also be used as prefixes and noun objects. This list shows how honorifics influence verb conjugation. So when we have the verb to eat, in plain form it's taberu, in respectful form mishi agaru, and continuing on. The whole word seems to change. From here onward, however, when I refer to Keigo, I'm generally going to be speaking of all 3 forms. So how is Keigo used? Honorifics are traditionally determined by relative sex, age, rank, office, generation, and formality of the situation. Its purpose, according to the National Language Council of Japan, is to keep transactions and interactions running smoothly within the society and economy. An example of this is manual Keigo. In manual Keigo, servers in Japan have a strict scripts that they are required to adhere to, and every interaction with a customer must come from the script. When I was in Japan, my fellow study abroad students and I found this very useful, as we could learn the scripts and then respond in turn. However, because of this, it was difficult to practice much Japanese with the local shopkeepers. So the question I began to develop was, does Keigo give regard to individual? Well, let's examine some ways in which Keigo has been interpreted within the literature. In 1978, linguists Brown and Livingston published their groundbreaking work on honorifics called Universals in Language Use, Politeness Phenomena. In this publication, they based their theory on the assumption that humans are continuously and consciously projecting a social self-image referred to as face, and that politeness is an outcome of the mitigation of a face-threatening act. According to Brown and Livingston, politeness strategies are divided into negative and positive politeness. Positive politeness strategies are friendly acts which emulate the addressee's positive face, such as noticing the addressee's needs, claiming common ground, and seeking agreement. Negative politeness strategies are respectful acts that include the use of indirect expressions, hedges, and respectful terms. For example, in Japanese, when speakers challenge the listener's face with a request, they use a humble form to soften the affront. So here's an example of a negative politeness strategy. When a professor asks for a favor from a student, even in a position of power that doesn't necessitate subjugation, they may circumvent a direct challenge to the listener's face. For example, Yamada, give me the book, is a lot different from Miss Yamada, would you mind passing me the book? In this later phrase, we have an example of when honorifics and Keigo are being implemented to soften a demand. Continuing on with politeness theory, to establish a universal formalism, Brown and Levenstein created a formula that would determine which strategy would be used in a particular situation. Here we have a rather complex equation where W is the weight of the face-starting act, D refers to the distance. Yeah. This boiled down means that speakers choose to make a face-threatening act or not, depending on the weight of the imposition and the consequences associated with the act. So, under politeness theory, Japanese honorifics are equated as a negative politeness strategy. But my question is, if that's the case, language would be much more uniform than it is. Everyone would speak in manual Keigo, or according to a script. But what recent research has found is that the use of honorifics varies even within the same context. Even Brown and Livingston attempted to revise their theory 10 years later and admitted that it is difficult to have any real precision in this area because of the enormous complexities of the reasoning involved. To contrast the rigidity of Brown and Livingston's formalist approach, I propose that Japanese speech and honorifics, rather than formulaic, are fluid and emerge with interaction and Keigo, which cannot be predicted with a mathematical formula. Honorifics as discernment. Moving on to the second theory, I would like to explore the discerning capabilities of Japanese Keigo. In 1986, Japanese linguist I.D. Sachiko published The Linguistic Politeness of Japanese and Americans, in which she refuted Brown and Livingston's politeness theory, and in its place claimed that Japanese did not fit their universal model, but instead of negative and politeness strategies, Sachiko proposed that the use of Keigo was a matter of discernment. This act of determination is called wakimai. Wakimai can be described as a set of prescriptive sociolinguistic norms that all Japanese speakers are expected to adhere to. Its purpose, as described by Sachiko, is to acknowledge the positions and roles of those engaged in conversation. There are 4 basic social rules to wakimai. Be polite to a person of higher social position, be polite to a person with power, be polite to an older person, and to be polite in a formal situation. These 4 rules establish a sociolinguistic hierarchy and enforce the prescriptive norms appropriate to each particular situation. However, this theory does not seem to account for the variability in situations and the creativity of conversational participants. When the Japanese speak, they may feel constrained by how they are expected to speak, according to their social hierarchy. However, that does not mean they will always follow this norm. For example, in ceremonies or business meetings, a senior may speak very politely to a junior, but when they are together casually, the senior may abandon honorifics. However, honorifics cannot be exclusively tied to context, and all Japanese interactions are not a matter of ritualistic forms. Under Sachiko's definition of Keigo, no agency is being given to participants. So let's move on to the third theory. Honorifics as social construction. In recent studies, various researchers, including Carol, Akimoto, Cook, have explored Keigo as a social construction. Within this perspective, Japanese speakers have agency. They strategically choose whether or not to use honorifics in order to further their interrelational goals. However, unlike politeness theory, the negotiating methods cannot be predicted, as the manipulation of Keigo is continuously shifting. Under this perspective, Keigo use is not just a reflection of the expected wakimai, nor is it as formulaic as politeness theory. Instead, Keigo as a social construction shapes and recreates the social norms within the Japanese culture. Here we have a great quote from Cook that says, "Honorifics make a certain context happen in the speech situation. Users of referent honorifics strategically choose to use them as a tool to discursively construct their identity vis-a-vis the institutional role that they assess they are expected to play." This quote from Cook gives us an idea of how Keigo, as a social construction, is the intellectual hybrid between politeness theory and honorifics as discernment. Speakers determine what methods of Keigo they will use by both the strategy in which they preserve their identity, as well as those prescriptive norms they feel they are forced into by Wakimae. I agree with this position on Keigo. However, I want to go a step further. My linguistic postulate. A linguistic postulate is a theme or motif that can be found in almost all sentences of a language, and it is a feature that is used repeatedly by the language to organize culture. My postulate is there is hierarchy built into the codex of the Japanese language, which is reflected within Keigo. However, honorifics are a social construction, and as such, speakers can manipulate the usage of the hierarchy to navigate and create unique contexts. So let's break that down a little. Hierarchy within Japanese forces speakers to choose between the honorific options encoded in the language. Japanese language needs honorifics because Japanese sentences do not require a subject, and so it's through the use of honorifics that the listener knows who or what is being talked about. Honorifics can not be dispensed at will because there are no situations that take place without a social context. In essence, there is no neutral mode. There is no neutral mode in regard to honorifics because the lack of which in itself is a statement. For example, when the doors on a Japanese train are closing, the PA announces, "Do ga shimate marimasu," which figuratively translates to "the doors are completely closing." However, it is more literally interpreted as "the lowly door is approaching the completion of closure." In this situation, the trains are making a demand of the patrons, and rather than making the announcement a statement, this complex situation is mitigated by the hyper-correct use of humble and polite forms of Keigo. So in not using Keigo at all, it would be an affront to the perceived social order. Let's continue on with hierarchy. We can examine the suffixes of the Japanese language, where a scale of formality exists when addressing any second party. These suffixes include no suffix, which is considered very rude and only to be used with very close friends. That's people you grew up with or your partner. San is the polite term that you use with everyone if you don't know their social standing. Kun is a familiar term. That's like what you call your guy friends. Chan, affectionate term, frequently used in addressing females. Sensei includes teachers, doctors, and writers. And sama is a significantly more respectful version of san. So included in this hierarchy is seniority. In Japanese society, the principle of seniority is crucial to social organization. Slight differences in age or time spent at a company or school determine the nature of these relationships. Senpais, my apologies. Senpai is a word that means senior, and kohai is a word that means junior. When you are addressing your senior, you always call them senpai. However, when juniors are addressed, they're addressed with these familiar terms, not by their title of kohai. As we can see, there is a range in ways interpersonal relationships are defined by honorific use. I'd like to give some examples of agency. Kogyaru kotoba, or high school girl language, is a fantastic example of the agency Japanese speakers have. Even the name itself is a display of how creative and unconventional their use is. Koko is the Japanese word for high school, gyaru is the Japanese pronunciation of the English word gal, kotoba simply means word, and so a mix of all these three, with some brevity, you get Kogyaru kotoba. Kogyaru kotoba consists of a closed group, meaning it's only females of a certain age, no one else really knows what they're saying. But Kogyaru kotoba is constantly evolving, with lexicon falling in and out of favor every year, including acronyms created from English and French loanwords. There's this variety of speech avoids honorifics and suffixes and uses them only kind of mockingly. Kogyaru kotoba challenges traditional assumptions of the Japanese society, and it causes some kind of disgruntledness in their seniors who hear them speaking it. But surprisingly, Kogyaru kotoba style of speaking is accepted as a type of dialect, even if it's looked down upon. So I'd like to restate my postulate. Based on the evidence I have found by analyzing Japanese in the context of these perspectives, I am able to postulate that the hierarchy built into the Japanese language is reflected within Keigo, and that Japanese honorifics are a social construction in which speakers have the agency to manipulate the linguistic hierarchy, to adapt, and to create incalculable contextual relationships. To narrow my point down even further, hierarchy in Japanese is unavoidable, but people navigate how to use it. And so furthering my assumption that language and culture are in a feedback loop and constantly connected. Thank you.